Yeah, welcome everybody to this series. This is the first time we've ever done something like this. We're, as you know, hosting 15 people online over the next 2 days, including today. And I'm really excited to introduce Bruno Basso, who's our first speaker. He founded SIBO Technologies, which is a really amazing company, which he's about to explain. And yeah, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. Otherwise, this video will be posted later online, and yeah, I'll post information about how you can find that later. And then, if you would want to like put your contact information out, I can also arrange for that to be done. But yeah, so would you mind telling me a little bit about like SIBO Technologies and the background of the company?
Yes. So first of all, thanks for inviting me to this conversation this morning. It's always a pleasure for me to share some of the, I guess, some of the achievements and the things that have gone well in transferring research into a commercial company like SIBO. So as you know, I'm a professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences, and throughout my career, I always worked on using remotely sensed imagery of different platforms, whether it's handheld devices or drones, airplane, or satellite, linked with crop simulation models, and I can go a little bit more in details, in order to understand the interaction between the soil, the plant, and the atmosphere. So SIBO Technologies is a result of this science, basically. And the reason SIBO is, I think, appealing and useful to the community and different stakeholders is because it has allowed the research that I did carefully in many sites to be scalable, to be basically applied to just about any parts in the world. We don't have the system at the moment. You wouldn't be able to click on any field in Tanzania and learn what you can learn about the US fields, but there is the potential to do the same. It is really more of a trade-off of the investments of funding that SIBO has received versus the demand and the possibility of generating revenue, because it is a startup trying to again generate funding to maintain the people and grow as much as possible as it is happening.
Yeah, I remember I said this when we originally met, and I still think it's true that you had the coolest picture of some like ag tech founder that I've ever seen, with like I think it was a picture of you walking alongside a cornfield with like a drone flying.
Sure. Yeah.
And that was really cool.
Yeah, there was it is a good description of the work that I do. As I mentioned earlier, the role of technologies, in this case drones, it's paramount, because it's able to capture at a very high spatial resolution, so basically nearly 1 centimeter on the ground, how plants react to the conditions that they are exposed to. So how they reflect the light as they exposed to lack of water, lack of nutrient. So the possibility of capturing this and obviously scale across the entire Midwest, 80, 90 million acres of the analysis that we did, it's obviously useful across the board, is useful for environmental quantification. So, be able to, and environmental characterization. So quantification, meaning what is the potential of a certain field, given the fact that we have observed both the impact of the weather, soil, and the type of management, changes in genetics, these things are all captured in the simulation model
Mhm.
that is a process-based biophysical models. So it's not a model that often is called, like more statistical, that relies on observation of responses in order to scale it to someplace else. The model generates the data
Mhm.
as a result of the science that we know, basically how far we have gone into understanding these mechanisms. They are captured in mathematical forms. So the environmental quantification of a field deals with what is the potential of this field to lose a fraction of the fertilizer that you put in, that you apply in order to have a high yielding crop, or what is the overall greenhouse gas emissions, which is very important for climate change, both adaptation, mitigation, and surface runoffs. And so the environment is very important, and farmers, they never had the possibility of understanding how good their practice was from an environmental standpoint. The only matrix they had, it
Mhm.
was economics, right? I put this much and I get this much out. The economics is critical because things are adopted if they pay. And so it's very important to consider that profitability and environmental sustainability, they have to go together. You just, and so SIBO allows to, with the data and information that farmers could access through the website,
Mhm.
to be able to make better decisions where trade-offs are more quantifiable between profit and environmental impact.
Yeah, so I had actually seen that described in an article that you had sent over, where it called you the Zillow of farmland. And I can see how this relates, tying in the land value for the farmers. And so I was wondering, is that how SIBO had originally started? And do you still collect information with drones?
Right. SIBO does not collect information with drones. That's much more the science that we still conduct in Michigan State to be able to learn more about the responses and the bands, and how you scale in terms of resolutions, how you go from satellite, that one that they go historically back at 30 meters versus 1 centimeters. So the drone is really more tailored for research questions. Eventually, farmers could, there are some of them using on their land, but it's it's more of a question of understanding the highest level of knowledge, that can be captured versus how you could scale at the level of the drone using satellite. So yes, so that's a good question. A startup almost never, it's they described always like a roller coaster. It's never a linear path because of what they originally thought was going to be, the key of, the monetizing machine. It may not have turned that way for various reasons.
Mhm.
And so initially, if I define again, SIBO being a platform that allows quantification of sustainability, profitability, land value, and again, ecosystem services generated on a farm. If you put all of them together, you can make a lot of decisions, a lot better decisions. And so originally, because the model relies heavily on science, on this crop simulation model linked with the imagery, we thought that this information was really useful to all so basically the supply chain in agriculture, both the seed companies, any of these companies operating in the space, to help farmer basically have just a better options, and even themselves to be able to quantify better the responses of the genetics when they do genetic traits experiments. They just place it in the fields, not knowing how much variability is in that field. would a certain cultivar perform better in an environment versus another? Yes, they place panel all over, but then it's still limited to the time and the weather and the soil and the conditions that you do that study. So the possibility of scaling both over space and time, we thought that was of very much of appeal to basically having this, machine that would generate the data and saving on a lot of the experiments, where only a smaller fraction would have gone as experiments, and the rest could have been simulated, because there wasn't necessarily a strong component within the seed companies to basically have an environmental characterization. No one has used that technology, wasn't available. No one has used the imagery to understand how stable a field is in terms of productivity. Always zones they always perform well versus zones they underperform, or areas that they fluctuate. So then understanding the responses of the seeds to these different conditions was valuable. Then, because again, it answers so many questions, the next thing that came, so that component, it's not that didn't generate, it did, but then it's used mainly by one company, and so they run the simulation to basically design new genetic traits, new cultivars, before they do the experiment. What if we change the duration of a phase? What if? So there is lots of, there are lots of questions like that. Then the land value, it's obviously very, very appealing in a way that, as you mentioned in this article, that the press release that Michigan State launched with about SIBO of the Zillow, is that in agriculture, and in previous conversations, I mentioned that to you, that there wasn't really a transparent way of evaluating land. You basically, it's as I bring the analogy of, be able to buy a car. You got all the possible tools to quantify how many kilometers has done, the tire usage and transmissions. And so you do an inspection of a house, but you can't really do an inspection of a field. You can't just take soil samples, and because of the large variability, the uncertainties in the measurements. And so there are all these things made it clear that a field could be better quantified by having this historical perspective of how the weather would impact the soil. The soil is known, there is a lot of public information data that we were able to basically analyze, and from that we generated new products. So land now has a more transparent value based on the risk of obtaining a certain level of yield. So if you were to know, yes, you could produce a certain amount, you can produce every year 200 bushels, versus 200 bushels are only really obtained maybe 20% of the time, versus 50% of the time could be 150. And so you have this distribution of yields that will place the buyer in a different perspective, and at least compare which field. So if there are options, sometimes, the buying and leasing, it's independent from the value. It's just convenient, right? You got your neighbor selling and you want to expand. So obviously you may not need a tool like this, but it's, I guess, known that the land is basically the areas that has never lost money. So people that invested in land, there's just the biggest asset versus, the stock markets. And so there is a big component out there of people interested in investing in land. And so I'll stop here, but there was never a through linear journey. And then the last piece of variation from the initial, the basically objective now is about the possibility of quantifying if you were to change management, and that goes under new terminology of like regenerative agriculture, not only stopping environmental impact, but also sequestering more carbon, so go on a positive trend. And so there are, a list of things that people do, like not tilling the soil, only seeding through the stubbles, the residues, putting cover crops and rotations. And so with that, now SIBO quantifies the possibility of sequestering carbon, and that will be very helpful for farmers to quantify the credits that they could generate in a volunteer market or the regulated market.
Yeah, so we had just touched on that in the beginning, and then I think that would be worth coming back to as well later, because I think the environmental impact of this company is, well, it's pretty huge. It seems like it's something that can scale pretty well. And I remember when I talked to you originally, you had mentioned that was the initial problem. And so if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to walk through basically the process of what starting this company was like, and well, how you started it. And so I remember I'd mentioned the drones before, and you had said that was part of your initial research. So would you mind like detailing, well, what did that mean? Why were you using these drones? And then were you planning on starting a company?
Yes. So as I briefly mentioned in the beginning, my research has always focused on understanding spatial and temporal variation of plants. Why plants in one area perform differently than another, and with the ultimate goal of managing also them differently. So do the right thing at the right time at the right place, be able to feed them the ones that they needed to be fed in a certain way, almost very much like a human decisions. A person that has more appetite and a bigger body and more demand and so on will obviously eat or should eat more than someone that doesn't do much work or in terms of exercising or has a smaller body and so on. So plants are just like that.
Really? Yeah.
And because of these variations, it needs to be quantified. So as I mentioned initially, before even drones came out, I was using airplanes where you will fly and take photos with this spatial variation. So remote sensing, it's critical because it's based on a physical principle of plants that reflect light in the electromagnetic spectrum. So they reflect the light in the green band, and the higher this reflectance in more diluted green, meaning less nitrogen, versus darker green, which is much lower reflectance, more absorbance of the green. And opposite in the red, you will have reflectance because of different compounds like carotenoid, xanthophyll, they cover the chlorophyll. And so you see plant either senescing or being more yellowish because of nutrient deficiency. So the remote sensing part was critical. And I moved from aeroplane or satellite into drones actually when I joined MSU. I bought the first drone almost 10 years ago now. And that was actually a revolution in a way that we were able to quantify this variation anytime we wanted at the resolution that we wanted. Yeah. And the model had been around for a while because it was a result of very interesting story. If you're interested, I'll mention that to you. But the model was a process, again, based model that could be parameterized spatially. So apply in different parts of the fields to be able to come up with that prescription, as we say, these RX, like a doctor to say, you have this much nutrition needs and you have this much nutrition needs. And so the drones allowed me to do that. And they were, because they were the beginning, I got some coverage from the media. It was like a very nice PBS news hour, like at 7 p.m. prime time and on TV. And they basically showed what these drones can do for agriculture. It was really the beginning of the use. So Michigan State is very proud of that. And then basically the next day, I received a lot of phone calls wanting to take this to the next level in, becoming more scalable. And so venture capital firms from different places both the two coasts, actually in Chicago, but people from California, Boston, New York, and Chicago called. But I made a decision to join this company called Flagship Pioneering because the others were much more interested in acquiring and basically investing and taking some of the technology with them and develop on their own, which obviously to me was a sign of not fully understanding how complex the whole thing was. And Flagship Pioneering provided all the funding to start the company from scratch, realizing that my role was needed in being able to get, things gone at a level where it is now. So if it wasn't for obviously the technology and my idea, coupled with the funding of starting a brand new company from Flagship, this obviously SIBO wouldn't exist. So it is from the drone in the beginning, but then I meant, as I've said already a few times, they serve the highest level of understanding and resolution, but the key to scale is to move into satellite imagery or obviously airborne, which still provides a limit because you can't fly everywhere. You would have to have different planes and different companies, but that's still happening nowadays. But in the future, satellite are basically making this possible because you have a coverage of the Earth every single day now, and at a very high resolution so far, not as high as the drone, obviously, but it's 3 meters on the ground. So it's a very high level of details, which even overcomes some of the issue related with cloud coverage, because if it is an optical sensing and a cloud sits on top of a field, then you wouldn't be able to see underneath. But we work on new algorithm to understand what's underneath the cloud based on artificial intelligence, and so there is a lot of progress going into that, and the scalability is obviously has happened, as you'll be able to see from the website, which we haven't mentioned yet, cibotechnologies.com.
Yeah, it's super cool. I've been on there, and you can type in any address or just zoom into the map, and it'll literally evaluate the land and like section it off for you. It's incredible. And if I'm not mistaken, it does this worldwide, correct?
It does work. The website is only shown for the US, but we have basically done the same type of stability analysis and risk in sections of Argentina, Brazil, heavily in Europe, and not just on commodities like corn. So we have other species. We working closely with another company that does this sorts of similar work in trees, a digital tree sorts of company. And actually, in biotechnology is also another sister company of SIBO's, funded by Flagship Pioneering, that is interested in understanding the sustainabilities of orchards, of in general trees.
Yeah. So like stepping back a little bit, so when you did get the funding, what stage was your idea at? And I know that you had gotten some media coverage about it, and so the novelty was there, but how far into the development process were you, and then what were you looking to do?
Well, the technology, when we joined Michigan State University, the MSU technology played a critical role in making this happen, because I was completely novel. I mean, I was new to the system. I just didn't really know how the commercialization pathway would work. So they played a role, and they are investors also in SIBO. And so the technology was at a stage that it was operational. So the model was already there and the imageries were there, but they weren't put it in a platform, and they weren't scaled and clean and visualized in the way that they do now. Since then, there has been a significant amount of both investment and amazing work by the programmers at SIBO to take it to, so because if you were to see, mine wasn't any platform, you will run, the model from the codes, and you'll visualize the map. You could do it anywhere, but it wasn't scalable in a platform visualization sorts of thing. But the science and the questions were basically operational completely. That's why flagship pioneering really leads the way, I believe, in pioneering this type of companies, and because they're interested in scalability, they're interested in becoming global, and for each of these companies becoming big, and not solve a very small, kind of niche market. And so they saw the scalability in terms of how the stage of where it was, but obviously there are fully programmers that just work every day on doing what you have seen to be able. So obviously I didn't have any search possibilities or didn't have any integration of the different components in there, but the science obviously was there, and that's why it started. And so from that perspective, that's the technologies. Then they invested through the regular, there was an initial investment, and then Series A, B, and we are now going towards a pretty big Series C investment, which should launch more of an independent pathway for a while, and hopefully.
Yeah. What type of things were you looking to add when it was at that functional stage, and then you were turning it into a consumer product?
Well, I was, again, always interested in solving some of the problems. So if I had a request of a particular field that or a region that we wanted to address because of a problem, we could do that. But it wasn't all in basically one few seconds, in a few seconds where you will type the address and you'll be able to get all the information together. So that has been obviously, it wasn't our goal to go in that direction. We were interested in seeing, does this region, first we were very much focused on validating the science, making sure that these numbers are still generated from our knowledge that is captured into models, mathematical functions, and relies on inputs that sometimes you still have to have a pretty strong quality check coming in. So we as a scientist, we were trying to address all this, dealing with the uncertainties of the measurements of the inputs coming in. And so there was that initial stage where I still work closely with the programmers to make sure that they take this very scientific approach to continue to make the most reliable output, even though it comes from a commercial entity, but it's very much backed up by deep science that there was basically developed for several years and by several people working together.
Yeah. What type of people generally are interested in using the software?
As I mentioned earlier, it is broad because you can be in the land investments and understanding this. A farmer, he or she may just want to know how variable are the fields on the enterprise, on the farm, so they can go and so I really haven't kept up with the number of, they're in the several thousands of people that they're using it regularly. There is a subscription, which is nominal, really small, but SIBO really aims at solving big problems, and so trying to help proper investments to revitalize areas and make it possible. So there are companies that are interested, large companies, that they're interested in buying land to offset their emissions. So they own basically the land and they own the carbon that they can say we offsetting the emissions by managing them in a different way. So there has been quite a bit of interaction with those, providing that if you buy this field, you will need 15 years to offset the emissions of these 3 buildings of this site of operation that you have. But if you buy this, it may take 12 years.
Yeah.
But the price may be different, right? Because obviously this may be a better field, has more carbon. So these scenarios, and back to the analysis that I was telling you, Koya, is there wasn't that transparency. There wasn't that possibility of understanding, oh, I wish if I'm buying the right field, I wish if there was any other field that could make me save some years in sequestering carbon. So that's one component. Farmers and even policies, people, I mean, they can look at, they seldom, I mean, the government seldom looks at companies until they become, more popular and so on. But there is a very strong possibility, I believe, for helping the shaping up policies, because there are areas that they are not profitable. So SIBO could help identify those to be able to allocate them to alternative productions that they're not corn, which requires a greater amount of input. And so farmers will be willing to remove these lands that they're not profitable to go to more either possibility of generating energy on the farm through biofuels, bioenergy crops. They can be in some fractions of the enterprise and not the entire, so more on the marginal areas within fields, or alternative crops in terms of increasing biodiversity, pollinators, and so that could provide this component of the lands. The private sectors in delivering prescription is still interested, to be able to help farmers better manage fertilizer, knowing how much variability is available on their fields. And so it's pretty broad. Just about anyone dealing with the agricultural sector could benefit one way or another from gathering these insights.
Yeah, I thought the companies in particular was really interesting. Maybe I'm just not informed, but I had never known that like companies would buy land to offset like their carbon emissions. And, that wasn't anything that I'd considered. I thought it was just farmers looking to buy this. So I definitely see where you're coming from the scalability standpoint.
They are very large enterprise, very rich land investment funds. I mean, even some of the very big banks have an investment portfolio in agriculture and in farms.
Yeah,
they use different level of consultancy to say, is this good area to buy land? Is one thing that I haven't touched at all, which I think is very critical and very useful for SIBO to provide, that is the future. SIBO can handle a better prediction of what could happen because of different scenarios that could be simulated. So one of the very important points that I always make as a scientist, be able to know not just how well this land has been doing under this current management, but what if you change to something else? What are the alternatives to a platform like this? You couldn't do experiments because you will basically get white air until you see a result, and then you have to do it everywhere. So you basically simulate possible scenarios related to climate variability or climate change and say, well, where would this land be 25 years from now if temperature continue to increase? We have a very strong knowledge thanks to large community of people in obviously the most known IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, AgMIP, Agricultural Modeling into Comparison and Improvement, large community of scientists looking at scenarios of impacts of climate change on agriculture and food security and nutrition. So the example of simulating your field with increased temperature that returns that where it's projected to have a lower yields if you only look by a temperature standpoint. But then you can add, well, what if CO2 continues to increase? Maybe that would offset. But what if the rain becomes more erratic as it is and will basically not allow to have water at the distribution that used to happen? So you could have extended drought and you can have periods of flooding. And at the same time within a season. And so the model can handle those answers, both in an extremely well directional way, but also quantitatively. So you'll say, yeah, you projected to have a reduction of yield by this much, and so the buyer will say, well, that's still sufficient for me to know that I won't go beyond a certain threshold. And so the future, it's really in the hand of these sorts of systems where they can help you make better decisions, not just now or based on the past, but also how does the future look for that particular area. You may have heard, the Midwest will be shifted and will be, going north. That's already happening. Farmers, the corn is being grown in northern, all the way to the North Dakotas, into Canada. And then on our side, it's going much more into the Ontario. But is that the real Midwest where you can grow crops in a good soils, deep soil? No, because the soils in Ontario are not even close to the soils of Illinois or Iowa. So you will have those trade-offs. So as you can see, we've gone across the scale. Now it's more of a national problem of saying, well, how do we continue to get this level of productivity by knowing the challenges that we face with climate, or designing new genetics to be able to say, well, let's have shorter duration. And so a lot of companies, a lot of people are working on that. SIBO just provides the platform to integrate this and run these what-if scenarios in the simulations that currently doesn't exist besides what we have.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point to bring up, actually, is that you can not only scale like physically, and you can grow in terms of like where it is that you're observing. So like I mentioned earlier, this could be worldwide, but you can also scale in terms of the information, or you can scale in terms of like the prediction, where you have to predict what it's going to look like in 1 year, but you can also predict how it's going to look farther and farther out.
Exactly.
And
when you mentioned, yes, but sorry.
Oh yeah, do you think that this is the direction that the company will grow? And like, did that match your initial vision for the
Oh
company?
yeah, very much so. I mean, the science was always brought in with the vision of, what if I do something else? Now, that should just not be on this particular year or a management, but because planes are highly affected by the interaction of climate with soil, what if you change your soil, but in terms not of just changing physically, like you don't manage it right, that ends up changing, ends up being more poor, more degraded, and you lose soil carbon. So those are the questions that they always been very important to me as a scientist. And so when you brought the example of the other places in the world, one project that I had that SIBO is interested in taking on is also addressing question to food security, and be able to know in a forecasting mode, predictability of how one area is going to be short on food. That opens all kinds of, really novel sorts of activities in terms of, tailoring where food help should go, and nutritions. And we already know that many parts of the world, the food and the rotation that they have, it's not even close to have a full spectrum. So evaluating alternative crops before they even get there, it's very important. So there are many possibilities to be able to help getting the agricultural science into a way that it's scalable. And more recently, we use the word that is more circular. There is more circularity of the food system, be able to impact less by improving efficiency. Putting the right amount of fertilizer means reducing emissions, and also returning the residues, returning the manure, using cover crops that generate and return carbon. That circular system, it's the way actually the whole world is trying to go into these circular economies, to trying to reduce waste, because waste is never mentioned enough of how much there is.
I just want to start off by like saying that that's incredible, like how far ahead you thought, in terms of like the vision, it's clearly not limited by like any constraint. You know, you could say like, well, you can't predict what's going to happen 10 years in the future. What's the company going to do? And then there's some other routes for it to go as well.
Yes.
That's really interesting. And I'm wondering, so you had this vision for the company and you knew that this is what you wanted it to do. Um, you get money for this, and then how do you select people to join you
Hmm.
creating this? Because it
That's
sounds very
yes.
technical. And so, yeah, what was that like?
I'll tell you an interesting story that I, being in the university and dealing with potential students, brilliant students that wanted to join the lab and do some in when I sat in most of the committees hiring people in the relevant positions at SIBO, and I just was overwhelmed by the level of talent and being in the East Coast where there is a presence in East Lansing, but we're surrounded in places where university, there's location in Minneapolis, in St. Louis, but the attraction of people applying to SIBO
Mm-hmm.
was very much driven by doing something to help the planet.
Yeah.
So for the mission, and so they combined, they could possibly not distinguish a corn plant from a wheat plant.
Mm-hmm.
There were brilliant mathematicians from MIT or, just very good marketing, Harvard, or any of these really big schools that trains these people. They all had one thing in common, which was to be able to do something that would be more tangible and they would be part of this potential solution, which it was really overwhelming that they decided to join because of that. So the majority of the people they're mostly computer programmers, computer engineers, a lot like your major, analysts and computer visions. And so that's different from their world, that's just like, you wouldn't necessarily a few years ago think that so much computational will go in agriculture.
Yeah.
And now, once they knew that, they were blown out themselves to realize how powerful the platform was and the question that you could really ask. I mean, they made jokes that I was never interested in building anything that looked like an equivalent of the big platform for cats, or there are a lot Facebook for cats or other things like this. They could do anything, anytime with the technology, but they and so actually some of the brightest people joined SIBO because of the missions and I guess the vision that I had to this long-term sustainability. I was very fortunate to be able to be trained at a very good, one of the best land-grant university in environmental science, which is the place where I work now because I did my PhD at Michigan State, and with group of scientists and advisors, chiefly one, Joe Ritchie, who was my mentor, who had started going into a system approach in the early days with punch cards. And so, but now with the technology, I had this basically excitement and vision to bring space and time together to be able to address these questions. As I mentioned, it's not just about running a model in one area, but what happens in many different places. And now with the imagery and the possibility of this public information data available on climate and soils, like you said, you could do this analysis just about anywhere else in the world. Some places may have not the good resolution, but there are tools to improve the resolution by using machine learning or artificial intelligence to be able to scale, which is the example that I brought initially. Why do we use drone when you have a satellite? Because you need to understand how this accordion, between 1 centimeters and 30 meters work, and how we could build better knowledge to be able to scale at a higher resolution.
And so that was really the way of validating like the estimates that you were making with these satellite images, was to use the drone. And collect the?
The drone was more about identifying the type of bands and look carefully every single day, the behavior, the dynamics of chlorophyll, separating water stress from nitrogen stress. So you needed to have a careful, monitored field to be able to validate things that then they could be scaled. So it's not a replacement or it's not an improvement. It's a possibility of understanding very carefully and build the data sets. Then things could be then calibrated against and validated. And having independent validation is a critical piece for Stigo to be able to scale and address questions in places where the technology is not available.
So this sounds like the company arised from a problem. I know there's a lot of people out there that they know that they want to solve a problem and they're looking for one. What do you think helped you settle on this to do your research on, and settle on this to like run with as a company?
Yeah, I think I just can't help to say that the goal of building something as noble as a sustainable planet or a safe food or more food for anyone was the driver of my decision to be a scientist in agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
How do I get there? And I realized what are the challenges, what are the things that they are currently not done right. But again, with this underlying question of, I can't just help the farmer that I work with, that I do the experiments at the high resolution. I need to be able to scale and help farmers all the way. I bring the example of Tanzania because I had a big project in working on farms using imagery and using models in a very simplistic way on their iPads or phones with very simple sorts of questions. So I guess the creativity driven by this strong passion of solving this more large scale problem, and it's what characterized, I guess, my decision to be an agricultural scientist and not anything else. That's why I'm just pleased to be at MSU. I left, I'm originally from Italy, so I grew up in Italy, came to school here, returned back to Italy, but then returned back here because the dimension of the investments, the size of the universities, the possibility of dealing with the most brilliant colleagues, it was superior to what I had. And I make this joke, I was even, I guess, a little crazy enough to leave Rome for East Lansing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that definitely does sound crazy to come all the way over.
No, it doesn't. It's been one of the best decisions I've ever made because of the knowledge of being able to help people is far greater than be able to see the Colosseum every day.
Yeah, I think the beauty of it, it sounds like it's working on like a problem that's bigger than just you, right? And
oh yeah,
it sounds like you saw like a much larger problem and then managed to make it into an actionable, like addressable thing.
Let me just say one thing on that. We're far from having a solution for everybody, but we can certainly provide a list of solutions that they have a probability of success much greater than others across the board, whether you choose one field versus another, whether you choose one management decision versus another, whether you choose to buy one field because this requires more carbon. So all this is obviously going in that direction, and it's extremely helpful. The market will decide if it gets, people make this decision. But sometimes, because we're dealing with, by definition, sustainability has three pieces. I know we may run out of time, but I want to conclude by saying, you have the productivity in terms of profitability, that you have to make a living with these sorts of decisions in the agricultural sector. Then you have the community that demands more transparency more needs for better food, more high quality food, better environment, clean air, clean water, then you need the environment to be able to regenerate and produce ecosystem services. So places like the US, where investments from the government in forms of incentives play a critical role, because it could reward farmer as they already do in different ways, through insurance policies, or sometimes not with the most perfect, outcome. And so my goal is also to help, through the work that I'm doing both at Michigan State and at SIBO, to be able to help stakeholders design better policies, because policies are the help identifying, solutions better, quicker adoptions, because it's all about trade-offs. All about trade-offs. As a good friend of mine, John Antol, says, an economist, it's all about trade-offs. If you can't just see things from one side, you have to basically put yourself into the different dimensions of those sphere, the profit, the community, and the environment. And so we're trying to help facilitate all the decisions that someone could make in those three spheres.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good way of putting it, I think. And, that actually might be a good note to leave off on to conclude this interview. Is there any place that people can go to support you?
Well, as a scientist, I admire people that make decisions based on the environment and support the same vision that I have. I am just happy to provide any sort of support in terms of explanation if they contact me. But if they're interested in learning more about SIBO, then they can visit the website sibotechnologies.com, who's, I think, doing just an incredible work for the planet.
Yeah, I agree. It's really revolutionary. I know you probably hear that a lot because of, well, just how rapidly it's gotten picked up. But I think that hearing you explain the potential behind it, it really is kind of limited by how fast you can move at this point. And I want to wish you the best of luck moving forward. I think it's a really great cause, and I'm glad to have such great people working on it.
Thank you again, and I was happy to present this journey and some of the facts. And I wish all the best to the new entrepreneur. It's very important to have these visions and never give up on those.
Awesome. Well, I think then that'll conclude this first session. Thank you so much for being here, Bruno.
You're very welcome. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.